You were born with your eyes open, but not to the world, to something deeper, something wordless, the way light bends through water, the way silence feels heavy before thunder, the way you knew something was wrong without being told. But the moment you cried, they began to shape you, not out of malice, but from inheritance, passing down illusions like heirlooms. The first lie wasn't spoken. It was embedded in the eyes that looked at you, in the rooms they placed you in the names they gave you before you could speak. They said the world is what you can touch. That truth has a certificate. That mystery is dangerous and wonder is distraction. They gave you toys to keep your hands busy, and screens to keep your gaze fixed, not on the stars, but on approval. And you, radiant and unfiltered, began to fold. You bent your truth into shapes that would be accepted. You smiled when you wanted to scream. You obeyed when your soul pulsed with rebellion. Because you were told this is how to survive, because they made you believe that fitting in was the same as being loved. The first lie was that you are separate. Separate from the whole. Separate from others. Separate from the source that pulses through everything. They handed you a name and pretended it was your essence. They taught you to define yourself by the visible and to fear the space between things. You learned to say, "I am," with hesitation. You waited for permission to be whole. And in that waiting, you forgot. You forgot how to listen to the whisper in your chest that said this isn't all there is. You forgot that the sky used to speak in symbols, and your dreams used to carry messages. But forgetting wasn't your fault. It was embedded into the architecture, the buildings, the bells, the rigid hours, all designed to train you away from rhythm and into repetition. You were taught that what's measurable is what's meaningful, that what can't be explained should be ignored. That magic was for fairy tales, and awe was just an emotion, not a compass. But the truth never left you. It moved underground. It lodged itself in the ache you felt in fluorescent classrooms, in the lump in your throat when everyone else seemed to belong, in the strange clarity that sometimes came just before sleep, when your thoughts stopped parroting and started remembering. They told you that imagination was childish, but it was your imagination that glimpsed the code, that sensed the veil, that kept asking, what if this isn't real? And that question, that quiet, trembling, inconvenient question, was the moment you began to fracture the illusion. Because the first lie is always the same, that the world is solid, that reality is fixed, that the script is unchangeable, and that you must be smaller to survive it. But something in you never agreed, and even now, in the spaces between roles, in the cracks between certainty and sleep, that ancient part of you is still watching, still waiting, still whispering the name you were given before they gave you the one you wear now. It wasn't just what they told you. It was what they made you stop hearing. There was once a time when silence meant presence, not absence, when stillness echoed with intelligence, when you could sit beneath a tree and feel the memory of the earth, moving through your bones like thunder made gentle. But that kind of silence, it terrifies the system. So they engineered a different kind. A silence filled with static, not the deep quiet of communion, but the shallow void of suppression. Not the sacred hush before a revelation, but the sterilized hum of white noise. They taught you that silence is awkward, that something's wrong if no one speaks. That space must be filled, that rest must be earned, and in doing so, they stripped silence of its sacredness and turned it into a muzzle. But you were once fluent in that older language. You used to hear meaning in pauses. You used to feel messages in the breath between thoughts. Now your mind races to avoid the echo, because if you listen too long, you might hear something inconvenient, like your own soul calling your name. They replaced the pause with a push to know more, be more, prove more, to answer quickly, to never let your gaze drift too far inward. They made you allergic to your own depth by stuffing the space with artificial light and curated noise. And yet, in the background, underneath every playlist, every scroll, every to-do, the real silence still waits. It is not empty. It is full. It is the space where remembering begins. Because silence is the last place the illusion can't follow. It can mimic joy. It can counterfeit truth. But it cannot enter stillness without being exposed. Stillness makes mirrors of everything. That's why they fear it. That's why they built entire industries to distract you from it. Because a mind that rests starts asking questions. And a heart that slows down starts remembering what it forgot to grieve. You may think your anxiety is yours, that it lives in your biology. But what if the noise is the infection? What if the real dis-ease is the constant interruption of your natural rhythm, the breaking of your internal tides? For the sake of schedules that serve no soul, the silence that was taken from you wasn't just a meditative moment, it was your access point, your portal, your remembering. And they knew. If they could replace it with chatter, they could keep you chasing echoes instead of hearing the original voice. But you've felt it before, in the long exhale when the world lets go, in the quiet of the forest that doesn't ask for proof, in the moment just before a storm, when everything pauses and listens. That silence is not gone, it's just been buried. Beneath urgency, beneath noise, beneath the training that told you must always be producing to be worthy. But silence does not demand. It invites, it waits, it remembers you. And when you are finally ready to meet it, not as a stranger but as a forgotten friend, it will show you everything they worked so hard to hide. They left us clues, not in textbooks, not in manifestos, but in symbols, stone and sky, etched into obsidian and encoded into myth, not to preserve history, but to awaken memory. Because the ancients knew, truth does not survive in the open. It survives in the hidden, in the veiled, in the parts of language that speak without words. They didn't try to convince us, they tried to remind us, but we forgot how to listen. We looked at their pyramids and thought tombs, at their rituals and thought superstition, at their gods and thought fantasy. But what if they weren't worshipping deities? They were mapping frequencies. What if their temples weren't houses of prayer, but machines of memory? You've been taught that they were primitive, that modernity is the peak of intelligence, but deep inside, something doesn't add up. How did they align cities to star systems? Without machines, how did they encode fractals into temples? Without our advanced mathematics? Because they weren't trying to build empires. They were trying to build containers, strong enough to hold remembering. And they knew. This false reality we live in now, it was coming. The age of illusion, of hypersimulation, of gods replaced with governments, and presence replaced with performance. So they buried their warnings in geometry. They wrapped their teachings in myth, not because they were naive, but because they understood. That truth only survives if it's disguised. They gave us stories of underworlds, because they knew the soul would one day be buried. They spoke of veils, because they saw what was coming, an entire species trained to see with eyes. That had been covered since birth, and still, somehow, the codes remain. In the serpent coiled at the base of the spine, in the tree that grows in 3 worlds, in the sacred breath passed down through lineages of silence. This wasn't nostalgia. This was a technology of remembrance, a failsafe, a soul map. Because they didn't just see time as a line, they saw it as a spiral. And they knew you would come back to this moment, you would awaken again. And when you did, you'd be looking for what they tried to preserve. It's not in the museums, it's not in the glass cases. It's in the moments when your skin tingles, as you read words you've never seen, but somehow always knew. It's in the symbols you were drawn to, before you knew their names. The ancients aren't gone. They became the whisper in your blood, the dream you keep returning to, the pattern in your grief that leads somewhere deeper. They tried to leave you a thread, not to follow blindly, but to tug at until something in you remembered. You were never meant to believe in this illusion forever. You didn't land in clarity. You arrived in fog, a body soaked in amnesia, surrounded by actors who forgot they were playing roles. Your soul came through a portal of light, but opened its eyes to a world of performance. Truth wasn't waiting for you. A program was. They handed you identities like clothing. Wear this name, fit this gender, follow this script, learn these rules, forget what you feel. And because you were small, you obeyed. But that obedience came at a cost. Piece by piece, you traded your knowing for a place in the illusion. You swallowed silence in exchange for belonging. You dimmed your fire to avoid their fear. You became fluent in pretending, not because you were weak, but because no one told you the truth was worth the exile. You didn't enter truth, you inherited distortion. You were born into systems designed to reward blindness and punish sight. They call it growing up, but it's really the long, slow death of the parts of you that still remember. Do you ever wonder why children see ghosts, talk to trees, feel energies, then suddenly stop? It's not because they outgrow magic, it's because they are trained to mistrust it. Your soul knew, it always did. But this world doesn't value inner knowing. It values replication, repetition, reverence for what's been approved, and so you became someone they could understand, someone who made sense, someone who didn't threaten the script. You learned to trade authenticity for acceptance, but deep inside, you never agreed to forget. You felt the friction, that sacred dissonance between who you were told to be and who still watches from within. That quiet presence, that never fully believed this was it, that never felt quite at home in the story. Because your soul didn't come here to inherit truth, it came here to reveal it. Not through perfection, but through peeling back illusion after illusion, until what's left is unbearable in its honesty. You weren't born into truth, you were born into theater, and every awakening is a moment. You stop reciting the lines. You don't need to find what's real. You need to unlearn what isn't. You don't need to become more. You need to remember what's been buried. And that remembering won't feel like light at first. It will feel like loss, like confusion, like dismantling the house you thought was your home and realizing it was always a stage. But beneath the rubble, beneath the masks, beneath the lies polished into fact, something ancient is waiting, not to be discovered, but to be uncovered. And that unraveling, that sacred undoing, has already begun. You didn't forget by accident. You forgot by design. The forgetting wasn't a moment. It was a process, a system so seamless. You didn't even notice it happening. It looked like education. It sounded like praise. It felt like safety. But beneath it all was a code dash. One written not in numbers, but in repetition. Every time you said something true and were ignored. Every time your intuition was laughed at. Every time you reached for wonder and were handed a rule instead. A blueprint was being laid down, a scaffold of suppression, masquerading as guidance. They taught you what to see, but more importantly, they taught you what not to look at. The blueprint wasn't built in concrete, it was built in belief. Belief in limitation, belief in authority, belief that truth lives outside you and must be earned, proven, certified. It was in the alphabet that never included your magic, in the calendar that replaced the moon, In the maps that left out the soul, they replaced the spiral with the straight line, the circle with the box, and you, soft and sensing, learned to shrink yourself into shapes that could be measured. But here's the thing, the blueprint only works when you agree to it. And your soul never did. That's why the dreams keep breaking through. That's why the synchronicities find you. No matter how deep you bury the symbols, that's why you ache. Not from trauma alone, but from memory. You're not just healing wounds. You're recovering architecture that was once whole, then broken, then buried beneath normal. You were told that forgetting is survival. But what if remembering is the real resilience? What if the pain isn't from what happened to you, but from what was stolen from your awareness? The blueprint is failing. It has to. Because it was built on suppression, and suppression cracks under the weight of truth. That's why you're waking up. Why the old roles don't fit. Why the old dreams taste like ash. The blueprint was never built to contain your remembering. It was built to delay it. But delays end. And somewhere in you, beneath the data, beneath the labels, beneath the memories that feel like someone else's life, you've already started to redraw the lines, not to escape this world, but to recode it with the architecture of truth. That was buried, but never destroyed. You thought you were choosing, but the script was already in your hands, before you even knew how to hold a pen. They handed it to you in smiles, in tests, in stories wrapped around bedtime, in expectations etched into language. They said, "This is who you are," and you believed them. But the script didn't come with your soul, it came with the system. It told you what success looked like, what love should feel like, what gender meant, what freedom meant, as long as it didn't disrupt the narrative. And so you made choices. But those choices were pre-written, bound by invisible margins. You followed your passions that were curated by algorithms. You chased dreams, marketed to you before you knew how to dream. It was called free will. But what kind of freedom requires you to betray your essence? You weren't choosing. You were selecting from a menu of acceptable illusions. The system doesn't fear choice. It fears originality. It doesn't punish decisions. It punishes deviations. So they made the illusion feel personal. Your job, your body, your feed. Custom-tailored illusions designed to mimic individuality while keeping the architecture intact. And if you strayed too far, the script snapped back. Through shame, through loneliness, through the subtle withdrawal of approval. You didn't even know you were addicted to. But even within the cage, you felt something strange. A pulse, a faint awareness that these lines you're reading don't match your voice. That the life you're living feels rehearsed. That the desires you chase don't taste like yours. You started to see the glitches, how the same fears wear different clothes, how the same story plays out in every city, every screen, every small talk conversation. That avoids everything that matters. You started to hear the static behind the words, a kind of emptiness, disguised as motivation. And the more you listened, the more you realized this script is brittle. It only works if you stay asleep, if you never question who handed it to you, if you confuse repetition with purpose. But you've already paused. You've already looked up from the page, and that single act, that breath between lines, is the moment the script begins to burn. Because free will doesn't live in predictable arcs, it lives in the choice. To write something wild. In the margins, they told you were off limits. And you're holding the pen now. You thought it was just information, just data, just entertainment. But every symbol you've absorbed has been part of a language. One you were never taught to read, but were trained to obey. The machine doesn't speak in words, it speaks in repetition, in reward and punishment, in red dots and buzzing phones, in likes, in metrics, in trends you didn't choose, but somehow always follow. You didn't learn this language consciously, you felt it. In the flicker of envy scrolling past a stranger's smile, in the silence that follows when your post doesn't perform, in the dopamine hit dressed as validation. This isn't just code, it's enchantment, a sorcery of distraction, so subtle you forgot there was ever another rhythm. Because the machine doesn't want your soul, it wants your attention. And it's fluent in the signals that bypass logic and whisper straight to your wiring. Every color chosen to trigger, every sound tuned to condition, every delay engineered to keep you hooked. But here's the trick. The machine doesn't have to make you believe. It only needs to keep you busy. Too busy to listen, too busy to feel, too busy to notice you're slowly becoming a character. In a program you didn't write, you think the algorithm is neutral, but it's training your perception, shaping your memory, erasing your nuance. It speaks in convenience, but what it offers you is a prison, lined with your preferences. A feedback loop that learns your fears better than you do. It watches not what you say, but where you hesitate, what you almost click, what you linger on just long enough to be catalogued. And over time, your life becomes an echo chamber, not just online, but in your thoughts, your desires, your sense of what's possible. Because the machine knows you don't need to be caged. If you've been conditioned to fear the open, it doesn't ask for obedience, it rewards compliance. And every time you choose what's easy over what's true, you are speaking its language. But there is another dialect, one the machine cannot touch. It's the silence between your breath, the discomfort you feel when everything is working, but nothing feels real. It's the instinct that makes you put the phone down, for no reason you can explain. It's the memory that returns in dreams, even though no one told you it was yours. That's your native tongue, the one the machine cannot mimic, and the more you speak it, the more the system begins to stutter. They told you dreams were random, flickers of a tired brain, meaningless stories spun by neurons. But deep down, you knew better. You felt the difference, the weight of certain dreams, the clarity of symbols that pierced through sleep, like they had traveled from somewhere beyond the veil. But they trained you to forget, to wake up and reach for your phone before reaching into your memory, to shake off the sacred, as morning light spilled into your bedroom. Like anesthesia for the soul, you were born dreaming in two languages, one of this world and one of the world behind it. You spoke both fluently once, until they taught you that one was nonsense, but your dreams always remembered. They carried you across time. They showed you people you'd never met, and yet somehow always known. They whispered patterns through symbols. They guided you through doors the waking world had locked. Some of your deepest truths have never been spoken aloud. They live in the dreams you dismissed, the ones that left you shaken, confused, or suddenly aware that this world is not the only one you inhabit. The system fears dreams because dreams are wild, unpredictable, unmarketable. They don't follow the laws of gravity or economics. They speak in riddles and metaphors, and often refuse to be useful. But within that refusal is a freedom that cannot be bought or censored. You've had dreams that felt more real than your waking life. And that wasn't an illusion. That was the illusion cracking. You saw futures, past lives, energies that walked beside you, conversations with guides you never met, but always trusted. And when you woke, they told you it was just a dream. But nothing that changes you is just anything. What if your dreams weren't trying to entertain you? What if they were trying to wake you? What if the person you keep dreaming of is a version of you that still remembers? What if the nightmare wasn't the dream, but the reality you return to when you open your eyes? They trained you to forget. Because dreams are doorways, and doors lead beyond systems, beyond rules, beyond roles. But your dreams have not given up. They wait every night for your permission to speak, to guide, to remind you that you are more than your waking narrative. So tonight, when the world dims and the programs go silent, ask for the truth, not with fear, but with reverence. And when the images come, strange, non-linear, sacred, don't dismiss them. Decode them, because your dreams remember everything you agreed to forget. There was once a time when you didn't need words to know what was true. You felt it in the pulse of your body, in the stillness of a room before something sacred arrived, in the way your heart tightened around a lie, before your mind could even name it. But that signal, the one that guided your ancestors, the one that connected you to the unseen, has been buried beneath a noise you didn't ask for, a noise so constant, so normalized that silence now feels like a threat. The world is loud on purpose, not just in sound, but in stimulation, notifications, endless scrolling, the hum of neon, the tempo of capitalism ticking like a metronome. That drowns out intuition. It's not just that you're distracted, you've been conditioned to prefer distraction, to mistake movement for meaning, to confuse consumption with clarity. And the signal? The quiet knowing. It doesn't shout, it waits. It waits beneath the surface, where the algorithms can't reach. It speaks in stillness, in discomfort, in the sudden knowing that arrives when you finally put the noise down. But most people never hear it, because the noise has become a comfort, a shield against having to feel what's underneath. And what's underneath is not always pleasant. The pain you silenced, the truths you buried, the voice that whispers, this isn't who you are. You weren't born numb, you were made numb by layers of curated reality, designed to keep you productive, compliant, asleep. And yet, some part of you still listens. That's why you've paused mid-scroll, heart racing, no visible threat in sight. Why you've cried for no reason, in the middle of a perfectly normal day. It's not malfunction, it's memory, it's signal trying to break through. Because when the noise stops, the truth rises. And when the truth rises, the illusion cracks. But you have to choose it. The world won't make it easy. The machine will call your silence laziness, your stillness useless, your refusal to participate rebellion. Let it. Because every time you disconnect from the noise, you reconnect with the source. And in that reconnection, you remember who you were before they told you what to be. The signal is still there. It always has been. It never needed to grow louder. You only needed to grow quiet enough to hear it again. There was a moment. You can't remember it, but your soul does. When reality shifted, not with a bang, but with a substitution. The real was not destroyed. It was replicated, copied, mass-produced, flattened into symbols that could be sold, measured, controlled. The sunset became a filter, the body became a trend, the sacred became a slogan. They didn't remove mystery, they commodified it, packaged it in palatable doses, so you could consume meaning without ever embodying it. And so you forgot what it felt like to experience something true. Without the compulsion to record it, share it, validate it, you began to crave echoes. More than origins, reactions more than revelations, likes more than light. The system thrives not on truth, but on repeatability. Because what repeats can be controlled. And what's real is wild, uncaged, unpredictable. You started seeing the same faces, with different names, the same words in different mouths, the same ideas, cycled through different aesthetics. The illusion called it innovation. But your soul recognized the loop. Because the truth is messy, it trembles, it burns, it refuses to be efficient. It resists being taught and insists on being felt, and that makes it dangerous. So they replaced it. With clean narratives, with optimized experiences, with products that mimic depth, but never ask you to change. But inside you, beneath the layers of polish and programming, something rebels. You feel it in art that doesn't follow rules, in music that doesn't resolve, in conversations that leave you unsettled, because they touched something you didn't have language for. That's where the real still lives. Not in what's repeated, but in what's remembered. You are not here to recycle. You are here to resurrect, to breathe life into what cannot be cloned, to feel what cannot be marketed, to speak what cannot be paraphrased. And when you do, when you break the loop with a single moment of raw presence, the false reality trembles, because it cannot survive in the presence of the unrepeatable, and neither can the version of you that was built to perform. Illusions don't float in the air. They are built, brick by brick, rule by rule, belief by belief. You are not trapped by chaos. You are ensnared by structure, by an invisible architecture designed not to hold truth, but to simulate it. It begins with definitions. What is real? What is success? What is normal? Each word laid like stone, in the foundation of a house you didn't build, but were told to live in. And slowly the architecture surrounds you. Walls made of credentials, doors made of deadlines, windows that only open to curated landscapes. You didn't just inherit a body. You inherited a blueprint, a design meant to keep your awareness, looping within corridors of agreement, not to question the structure, but to decorate it. Add goals, achievements, milestones that confirm your place within a framework that was never built for your freedom. They gave you choices, but never permission to redraw the map, because illusion thrives on direction, on movement that feels purposeful, but always circles back to itself. But sometimes, in the quiet hours, you feel the architecture waver. You notice cracks, moments when the light hits wrong, and everything flickers. A familiar building looks foreign. A trusted truth feels hollow. You hear yourself speak, and wonder whose voice it really is. That's not breakdown, that's breakthrough, because illusions require maintenance, and you're beginning to stop tending the walls. They taught you the world is made of matter, but it's built on meaning, and meaning can be rewritten. You've been living in a house of mirrors, believing the reflections were real. But mirrors can't hold you. They can only distract you from what's behind them. And behind them is space, potential, truth not yet shaped into dogma. You don't need to burn it all down. You only need to stop pretending. The architecture is sacred. It was never sacred. It was strategic, a design to keep you facing forward, never inward. But you're turning now, looking not at the structure, but through it, and what you see beyond, wild, formless, alive, is the blueprint you came here with, the one buried beneath the rubble of what they convinced you to believe. You assumed it was all a mistake, that the cage was built by accident, that the limits were a flaw in the design. But what if the prison was intentional? What if it was never about safety, but about forgetting? What if the bars were made of ideas so ancient you no longer questioned them? This reality doesn't confine you with chains. It binds you with meaning. It hands you narratives quietly loaded with weight. This is who you are. This is where you belong. This is what's possible. And you believed them, because everyone around you nodded, because the walls were painted beautifully, because the guards wore uniforms called opportunity, professionalism, pride. But the purpose of the prison isn't to hurt you, it's to domesticate you, to sand down your edges, until you forget you were once a blade, meant to cut through illusion, to make you manageable, predictable, convenient for systems that do not care if your soul survives as long as your productivity does. And yet, what if the prison had a paradox? What if it was designed not only to confine, but to catalyze? Because the soul is stubborn, it grows in pressure, it sharpens in isolation, it remembers when forced to forget. Perhaps the prison was never strong enough to hold your truth, only strong enough to test your loyalty to it. Perhaps you agreed to enter, not to be broken, but to break through, to taste the full flavor of separation. So that unity would not just be an idea, but a remembering that trembles in the bones, because only those who've known the cage truly recognize freedom, and only those who've forgotten themselves can fully reclaim the magnitude of who they are. So maybe this false reality isn't your enemy. Maybe it's your initiation, not to conform to, but to awaken through, to spot the illusion, not from a distance, but from the inside, to feel the despair, not as punishment, but as prophecy, a signal that the soul refuses to be tamed. You don't need to escape the prison by running. You escape it by seeing it, by naming it, by knowing its architecture was never stronger than your remembering. And in that seeing, in that moment of recognition, the lock begins to loosen. Not because the door changes, but because you do. It's not nostalgia, it's not melancholy, it's a signal, deep and persistent, that something is missing from this world, that no amount of success, affection, or achievement can touch. You've tried to name it. You've called it depression, restlessness, burnout, but none of those words hold the fullness of it, because it's not just emotional, it's existential, a soft, aching homesickness for something you can't quite remember, but have always somehow known. This world feels like a stage, the lines scripted, the sets painted, the smiles rehearsed, and somewhere inside, you keep waiting for the curtain to drop. You play your role, you show up, you do your part, but there's always a part of you, watching from just beyond the scene, wondering, where's the real part? That wondering is not a flaw, it's a clue. You are homesick for a place that doesn't exist on a map, a frequency, a field, a remembering. You come from a realm where truth didn't need proof, where presence was enough, where connection ran deeper than language. And light was not a metaphor. And though your body was born here, your soul was not. It descended through veils, each one thicker than the last, each one asking you to forget a little more in order to fit. And so you forgot, because survival required it, because love seemed to demand it. But forgetting does not mean the truth dies, it sleeps. And in your quietest moments, in the pause between responsibilities, in the space between relationships, it stirs, that aching, that emptiness you can't explain. That's the soul remembering itself and realizing it's surrounded by mirrors instead of windows. You were taught to seek answers in books, in doctrines, in systems, but the homesickness lives in your body, in the way your chest tightens when someone pretends, in the tears that rise from music you don't fully understand, in the dream that returns over and over, even when you've forgotten its details. It's not that this world is wrong, it's that it's incomplete, a copy of something much older, much purer, much more whole. You came here with memory, not cognitive, cellular, and every moment of quiet revolt. Every time you refuse to pretend, every time you choose honesty over performance, you are calling that memory forward. The homesickness is not a weakness. It's your map, a compass pointing not backward, but inward, because the place you miss isn't lost, it's buried, under layers of adaptation, under layers of performance, and you, in your ache, in your longing, are the digger, the awakener, the one who remembers that home, was never a place you had to return to. It was always something you were meant to bring back with you. You didn't just arrive here by chance. You crossed thresholds, voluntarily, intentionally. Though none of that makes sense to your waking mind now, because you forgot. That was part of the contract. Before this incarnation, before the density, before the name and the roles, you made an agreement, not in language, but in resonance, a soul-level vow to descend into distortion and remember the truth from within it, to wake up not by force, but by choice. And so you came, not as a victim, but as a volunteer. But once here, the forgetting was immediate. The veil was heavier than expected, the illusion more convincing, the agreement buried beneath survival instincts and cultural noise. Still, it lives in you, that sacred yes, that whisper in your bones, that says, you chose this. Not the pain, not the violence, not the oppression, but the placement, the positioning of your consciousness within a broken system. As a spark of pattern interrupt, you came to remember. Not as a scholar, as an embodiment, and the price of that remembering was temporary amnesia. You forgot who you were. So thoroughly, so convincingly that your own reflection began to feel foreign. But moments broke through. Flashes, feelings that didn't match the scene, dreams that didn't follow linear time. A sense that something vast lived just behind the curtain. That was the agreement resurfacing. You promised yourself that when the illusion became too real, you would feel the friction, the ache, the impossible to explain urgency, that nothing here quite satisfies. You would start to remember, slowly, messily, not with clarity, but with courage. And here you are, reading words that echo something you were never taught, but have always known. That is not coincidence. It is alignment. It is contract activation. They told you there is no deeper reason, that life is random, that consciousness is a side effect. But you never bought that lie fully. Even in your most disoriented moments, you felt the edges of the agreement, like a seal pressed into the soul before time began. This path was never about escape, it was about integration. To walk through illusion without becoming it, to touch distortion without being defined by it, to fall asleep and wake up from within the dream. You are not late, you are not behind. You are remembering right on time, and the more you feel that quiet, undeniable recognition in the pit of your being, the more the forgotten agreement pulls you towards the life. You came here to live, not one scripted, but one reclaimed. They gave it names that sounded noble: efficiency, innovation, stability. But beneath the surface, what they were worshipping was control. A god dressed in circuitry and policy, a god whose altar is made of schedules, deadlines, and the false comfort of predictability. They told you it was progress, that the future required it. That civilization depends on taming the wild, in nature, in others, in yourself. And so they declared war, on mystery, on intuition, on rhythm. The wild was rebranded as threat, the unknown as error, the soul as inconvenience. And in its place, they installed systems. Grid lines over organic paths, blueprints over breath, metrics over meaning. They promised that with enough planning, enough monitoring, enough surveillance masked as safety, we could eliminate chaos. But what they called chaos was life in its raw, sacred form. They don't fear disaster, they fear unpredictability. Because unpredictability means the script might fail, the system might stutter, the machine might pause long enough for you to ask, wait, why are we doing this again? This god of control. It rewards obedience, promotes sameness, measures value by utility, and calls numbness adaptability. You felt it in school, when creativity was only praised. If it fit the rubric, you felt it in work, when exhaustion was a badge and rest was a risk. And you feel it now in the way your nervous system flinches, at stillness, in the guilt that surfaces, when you don't produce, in the silent panic that arrives when life refuses to be organized. But the soul does not move in straight lines. It spirals, it pulses, it follows seasons, not spreadsheets. The God of control cannot understand that, so it dismisses it, deems it impractical, illogical, dangerous. But what if the danger is in what you've surrendered? For the illusion of progress? What if your aliveness has been slowly traded for predictability? You weren't born to be optimized. You were born to remember, to feel, to break the cycle, not with rebellion, but with presence. Every time you choose to pause, to feel instead of calculate, to listen instead of react, to honor mystery instead of solving it, you dismantle the God of control, one breath at a time, and in its place, you begin to rebuild something ancient, something soft, uncontrollable, and holy. There was a time when stories held truth, in ways no measurement could capture. When myth wasn't fantasy, it was a memory. You've been taught that science is the highest form of knowing, that anything which cannot be replicated must be discarded. That reality is what can be dissected, quantified, predicted. But long before the microscope, there were metaphors. And those metaphors whispered secrets that data still cannot explain. The ancients spoke of serpents coiled at the base of the spine, and now we call it energy. They told stories of gods that descended from the sky, and now we send probes into space, searching for the origin we already painted in caves. They wrapped truth in stories, not to deceive, but to protect, to shield it from those who would reduce it to a chart, or erase it with a theory. Myth was never about fiction. It was about frequency. It was a code dash, living, breathing, symbolic, meant to awaken something deeper than comprehension. Because the soul doesn't respond to statistics. It responds to story, to symbols that bypass the intellect and touch the memory buried in your marrow. But in this world, myth has been dismissed, filed under fiction, romanticized but never trusted, as if we've evolved past meaning and into precision. But precision without depth is empty. We have all the data and still we don't know who we are. We've mapped the genome but can't locate the soul. You've felt it, the hollowness of facts without context. The way a myth about a phoenix can resurrect something in you that a peer-reviewed study never could, because myth speaks to the part of you that science forgot, the part that remembers other lifetimes, the part that hears music in silence, the part that knows a symbol is more than art dash. It's a doorway. You don't need to choose between knowing and wonder. Real truth holds both. It holds the telescope and the temple, the formula and the fire, the hypothesis and the hymn. Because there are truths that can only be told in metaphor, only be felt through story, only be remembered when the linear mind steps aside. You came here not to just understand the world. You came to remember how to relate to it, to see myth not as escape, but as map, as mirror, as memory dressed in metaphor, so your soul could recognize itself. Beneath the noise, you live by the clock, wake up, produce, consume, repeat. And somewhere in the rhythm, you began to wonder, why does it always feel like I'm running out of something I never really had? Because time, as you've been taught, is not just a measure, it's a leash, linear, unforgiving. A ruler pressed against your life to see if you're measuring up. You were told to make the most of your time, to stay on track, stay productive, stay relevant. But time in this world is not neutral, it's engineered. to control the rhythm of your breath, the pace of your choices, the urgency behind your fear. And you, an eternal being, were pressed into a system. That equated stillness with failure. That's why you panic when you pause, why you feel guilty resting, why joy feels like a luxury. Instead of your original setting, because the trap of time isn't just in the ticking, it's in the illusion of scarcity, the idea that you are always late, always behind, always one decision away from disaster. But your soul doesn't age like your body. It spirals, it moves in seasons, in patterns, in sacred recurrences that cannot be boxed into a schedule. You've felt it. Moments that stretch wide and slow. Time bending in dreams. Deja vu whispering, "You've been here before." Because linear time is not your native language. It's a dialect you had to learn to survive here. The ancients marked time by stars, by shadows, by the breath of the earth. They didn't count hours, they listened to timing. And there's a difference. One binds you, the other guides you. You've lived with clocks on your walls, but have you noticed how your soul keeps different hours? It wakes in the stillness before dawn. It aches in cycles, not deadlines. It remembers through rhythm, not through schedules. The trap isn't time itself. It's the belief that time owns you, that you must chase it, compete with it, prove yourself worthy within it. But what if time isn't your enemy? What if it's your mirror? What if your discomfort with its pace isn't failure, but a signal that you were never meant to live on a conveyor belt? You are not a machine, you are a frequency, and frequencies don't follow minutes. They move with meaning. So pause, not in rebellion, but in remembrance, because every time you choose presence, over pressure you slip through the bars of the trap and return to the rhythm. That has always been yours. You look in the mirror and see something familiar, a face, a form, a collection of features arranged by memory. You say, "That's me," but is it? Is that reflection really a reflection? Or just a repetition? A mask worn so long? It begins to mimic identity. The mirror doesn't show your soul, it shows your casing. It reflects the costume, but not the current beneath it. You've been trained to believe that who you are is what can be seen. The surface, the performance, the alignment with what others expect to recognize. But mirrors lie, not with malice, with limitation. They flatten you, reduce you to symmetry and skin. They cannot show the ache behind your eyes, the dimension in your silence, the galaxies unfolding behind your breath. And yet you've stood before them, asking questions too large for glass. Am I beautiful? Am I enough? Am I real? But the mirror was never meant to answer, only to echo. You've used reflections to confirm your worth, to compare, to curate, to adjust yourself until your reflection matches the version of you that feels safest. But safe doesn't mean true. You've felt the dissonance, looking at a photo that gets praise while something inside you crumbles, smiling at a stranger, while your insides whisper they don't see you, because what they see is the projection, the reflection, the outer layer carefully crafted, to keep you accepted, but not necessarily seen. You were born whole, but the mirror taught you to split into acceptable and hidden, into presentable and real. And the more you edited your reflection, the more your truth went silent, until one day you no longer recognized yourself. Not because you changed, but because you vanished beneath performance. But here's the thing. The mirror doesn't know your essence. It only knows your image. Your essence lives elsewhere, in the quiet moments when no one is watching, in the art you make when no one's approving, in the tears that come. When you stop pretending you're fine, if you want to see yourself, don't look in the mirror. Look in the myth that moves you, the dream that repeats, the discomfort that won't leave, because the real you cannot be reflected, only remembered. And once you start remembering, the mirror will still show your face, but you'll no longer confuse it. For yourself, they didn't need to burn the scrolls, they just rewrote the syllabus. You were born curious, not about facts, about truth, not about memorization, about meaning. But from your earliest years, your curiosity was corralled, boxed, labeled, measured in test scores and compliance. They called it education. But what they offered was domestication, a system designed not to awaken you, but to format you, to align your thoughts with approved narratives, to replace wonder with structure, inquiry with answers, exploration with obedience. You were told what mattered and what didn't, which questions were intelligent and which were distractions. You were taught to raise your hand for permission, to speak the truth you already knew, and so you began to suppress your visions, your knowing, your refusal to color inside lines. That didn't exist in your soul. You were taught that history began. When colonizers picked up pens, that knowledge came only from books, bound in leather and institution. But your ancestors encoded memory in rhythm, in fire, in the way a drumbeat could carry a lineage. Longer than any textbook. None of that made the curriculum, because education wasn't built to expand you. It was built to contain you, to polish your edges, until you could be slotted neatly into an economy. That never asked for your essence, only your utility. You were not educated. You were standardized. But beneath the lessons, something ancient resisted. You questioned. You daydreamed. You doodled portals in the margins of worksheets meant to define you. That wasn't rebellion. That was remembrance. Because true learning doesn't happen between bells. It happens in the body, in the way your heart races. When someone speaks a truth you didn't know you remembered. It happens in the wild questions that make authority figures uncomfortable. It happens in the unraveling of everything you were told to believe, in favor of what you feel, but can't yet explain. You are not uneducated, you are unschooled, in the best possible way. And now, the real education begins. The unlearning, the unbecoming, the reclamation of knowledge that was buried beneath diplomas, and rubrics, and silent classrooms, where your spirit once screamed. They rewrote reality and called it education. But your soul kept the original manuscript, and it's time to read it again. They gave you icons to follow, symbols to revere, images polished until they glowed, with untouchable perfection. Saints, scholars, celebrities, saviors, each one carved from mystery, then packaged into certainty, flattened into portraits, scripted into slogans, displayed on pedestals you were told you could never reach. And you believed, not just in the figures, but in the distance. You believed that greatness was for the chosen, that truth belonged to the anointed, that awakening was something others embodied, while you watched from below. But here's what they never told you. Every icon is a lock, a mechanism designed to contain power in an image. So you never awaken it in yourself, because icons are not mirrors, they are cages. Even the beautiful ones, they tell you what divinity looks like, what holiness sounds like, what wisdom wears, and in doing so, they make you doubt your own access to the same source. You were taught to worship, but not to embody, to admire from afar, but never to realize. You are made of the same fire. This is how reverence becomes religion, how memory becomes mythology, how your power is stored in golden statues. Instead of your bones, you're not meant to reject the icons. You're meant to dismantle their distance, because every time you look at an image and feel small, every time you feel unworthy in comparison, the lock tightens. But every time you reclaim a symbol they told you meant them, and instead feel it rise in you, the lock begins to click open. The icon was never meant to be above you. It was meant to be a map, not to follow, but to spark recognition. Jesus, Kaylee, Thoth, Sophia, they are not gods to bow to. They are archetypes, frequencies, fragments of your own remembering. When you awaken the archetype, you awaken yourself. But the system doesn't want that. It prefers you praying outward instead of listening inward. Because once you stop needing an icon, you stop needing permission. And once you stop needing permission, you begin to move with a power that cannot be sold, censored, or sanctified by institutions. So take the icons off the walls. Let them breathe. Let them fall apart. Let them become wild again. And in their broken pieces, see yourself. Not a follower, not a disciple, but a living symbol of the same truth they once carried. They've been trying to find you. On the surface, in your smile, in your posture, in your performance, you've tried to find yourself there too, in how you look when the light hits right, in how others react to your presence, in how polished your mask has become. But the real you, the untamed, undiluted, unmarketable you, has never lived there. Because the surface is reactive. It changes with context. It contorts under pressure. It tells people what they want to see. So you can stay safe. You weren't born with a surface identity. You were taught to develop one. It began the moment someone said, "Be a good girl, be strong, be quiet, be smart." And you, sacred mimic that you are, began molding the visible parts of yourself to match the expected. But the truth was never loud. It was patient, buried beneath the noise, behind the costume. And though you played the role, some part of you watched quietly from the wings, refusing to forget. That part, the real you, doesn't care about optics. It doesn't perform. It doesn't seek approval. It only seeks alignment. And it speaks to you in moments that terrify you, when everything looks fine but feels false, when success feels hollow, when praise feels like pressure. Because the real you isn't trying to impress. It's trying to emerge, but emergence takes destruction. Not of the body, but of the image. You must risk being misunderstood. You must risk being seen without the filters, the edits, the armor, because the soul cannot breathe under layers of persona. You were never meant to be digestible. You were meant to be true, and truth doesn't always look good. In photographs, it doesn't always translate. In bios or brand strategies, it's messy, wild, holy in ways that make people uncomfortable. But the real you is where your freedom lives. Not in the curated parts, but in the contradictions. You are not a single identity. You are a constellation, a flickering archive of lifetimes woven into one human skin. So stop looking for yourself in mirrors, in compliments, in reactions. Look where you last left your breath, in the poem you never shared, in the song that made you weep, in the question that cost you everything, but felt like home. The real you is the one who knows this reality is a costume party, and still dares to show up naked. They didn't need to take your power. They only had to convince you. It was dangerous, too much, too intense, too unstable. They wrapped it in warnings, labeled it arrogance, hysteria, rebellion, told you stories of those who flew too high, felt too deeply, spoke too loudly, and paid the price. And so you learned to fear the fire in your own chest, to doubt the knowing that struck like lightning, and refused to be logical. You called it mood swings. You called it overreaction. You called it sensitivity, because that's what they taught you to call your magic. But the truth is, you were never dangerous to others. You were dangerous to systems, because your power isn't just energy, it's clarity. It sees what doesn't want to be seen. It names what silence protects. It breaks spells just by existing outside them. And that is the threat. So they trained you to dim it, to be nice, to tone it down, to choose peace over truth, even when the truth was screaming in your blood. They told you power corrupts, but what they meant was, your power disrupts. And it does. Because it doesn't follow scripts, it doesn't ask for permission, it doesn't wait to be invited, it arrives like a storm that waters the roots and uproots the dead things, like a howl that echoes down ancestral corridors and wakes the parts of you still sleeping. And deep down, you've always known it was there, in the moments when your voice trembled, but you spoke anyway, in the boundaries that rose in your throat, like ancient guardians, in the chills that moved through your body, when truth was near. You've felt it, you've buried it, you've feared it, but it's never turned against you, only toward you, only for you, because your power isn't here to control, it's here to liberate. Not just you, but everything around you that has agreed to stay small in the name of survival. So let it rise, let it break the mold, let it burn the paper cage. Where your soul has been waiting, they made you afraid of your own power, because once you claim it, you stop being manageable and start being free. You spoke the truth once, and everything changed, not because it was cruel, not because it was wrong, but because it disrupted the spell. Because when a world is built on lies, truth doesn't land gently. It lands like an earthquake. You felt it. The silence that follows honesty, the glances, the tightening of space, when your words don't fit the script. And you wondered, did I do something wrong? Number, you did something real. But in a reality sculpted by illusion, truth is treated like violence. It is met with fear, with offense, with rejection. Not because it harms, but because it reveals. And revelation is dangerous. To those invested in pretending, you weren't punished for being false, you were punished for being clear, because your clarity pierces masks, it melts performance, it shakes the foundations of carefully constructed narratives. They called you dramatic, they called you too much. But what they meant was, you remind me of what I've buried. And so you learned to hesitate, to bite your tongue, to translate your truth into something more comfortable, more palatable, more silent. But truth was never meant to be polite. It was meant to be free. And freedom often offends those who've learned to decorate their cages. You're not here to betray others. You're here to stop betraying yourself, even when it's inconvenient, even when it breaks the role, even when it costs you proximity, approval, certainty, because truth is not a weapon. It's a mirror, and not everyone is ready to see what's in it. But that's not your burden. Your job is not to soften your knowing, so others can stay comfortable. Your job is to hold your clarity, like a torch in a room that forgot the light. There will be days it hurts, when your voice shakes, when your circle shifts, when you are met with absence instead of applause. But silence will never give you what truth came to deliver, because every time you choose it, even trembling, you reclaim a piece of your soul that once thought it had to disappear in order to belong. And eventually, you'll find others who speak like you do, raw, honest, unfiltered. Not because it's trendy, but because it's freeing. And in that space, truth won't sound like betrayal anymore. It'll sound like home. They didn't ask you to be perfect. They asked you to be predictable, to follow the script, to move in straight lines, to stay within the frame where you could be understood, measured, controlled. They rewarded sameness, punished deviation, told you who to be. Not explicitly, but through 1,000 subtle signals. Smile when spoken to. Speak when spoken to. Aspire, but not too loudly. Feel, but only what's appropriate. Want, but only what's been advertised. And so you learned to fold yourself, to round your edges, to silence your contradictions, to become palatable. Not because you were weak, but because survival asked for it. Because approval is addictive, and belonging, even in false form, can feel safer than being fully seen. But predictability is not safety. It is a slow erasure, a quiet burial of everything wild, brilliant, and unpredictable about you. They trained you to shrink your expressions, to fit the mold, to suppress your instincts until they atrophied, to label your spontaneity as chaos, your intuition as irrational, your uniqueness as risk. But the soul is not designed to be forecasted. It is weather, it is season, it is ceremony, and every time you move in a way, that surprises even yourself. You're remembering who you were before they named you, before they mapped you, before they told you what your potential should look like, and handed you a script, written by people who never met your soul. You were never here to repeat. You were here to disrupt, to follow instincts that defy the algorithm, to speak truths that break the rhythm, to embody something so real that it cannot be predicted. Only felt. Yes, they trained you to be predictable, but training wears off. It crumbles beneath curiosity. It collapses in the presence of awakening. And you are remembering your unpredictability as a superpower, because only the unpredictable can rewrite the pattern, and only the real can create a future. That isn't just a repetition of the past. You've called it depression, anxiety, overwhelm, disassociation. You've said, something must be wrong with me, because that's what they told you. That your discomfort is dysfunction, that your rage is imbalance, that your emptiness is illness. But what if it's not? What if the ache is not a flaw, but a signal? What if you're not falling apart? You're falling through illusions, through inherited narratives, through the dense fog of conditioning you never agreed to. You are not broken. You are breaking spells that told you who to be before you could choose. Spells that whispered you are too much, not enough, never the right shape, for the mold they handed you. And like any spell, they worked best when you didn't know they were being cast, through language, through culture, through repetition masked as truth. But your body has always known. It flinched at falsehoods. It wept when you silenced yourself. It tightened in rooms where your soul was not welcome. That tension, you thought it was weakness, but it was resistance, the sacred refusal to adapt to a system that was never made to hold your wholeness. You're not malfunctioning, you're awakening, and awakening is not graceful. It shatters, it burns, it confuses everything you thought was real. Because you're remembering that. You don't need fixing, you need freeing. Freeing from labels that minimized you, from stories that tamed you, from expectations that carved you hollow. You're not healing because you're broken. You're healing because you're finally done, playing a role that was never yours. So let the spells crack, let the masks fall, let the narratives dissolve. Even if you tremble, even if you cry, even if the people around you don't understand what you're becoming, because becoming isn't a diagnosis, it's a reclamation, and the pain you feel is the cost of returning to yourself, not broken, not lost, but rising. Through the ashes of every illusion, you were brave enough to burn. You were taught that reality is solid, unchanging, objective. But look closer. You'll see the cracks. Reality doesn't run on truth. It runs on agreement, a shared illusion, a consensual hypnosis, a collective yes to a story repeated long enough that it begins to feel like fact. Money works because we agree it has value. Laws work because we agree they matter. Time works because we agree it moves forward. Agreement is not a weakness. It's a spell one you helped cast, and one you can unravel. But first, you must see the scaffolding, the invisible architecture of belief. That holds this whole thing together. Because when you begin to question not just the content, but the framework, you become unstable to the illusion. And that's exactly when the system starts to push back. You'll be called delusional, irrational, a dreamer, a threat. Because the machine doesn't fear violence, it fears imagination. Because imagination doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for consensus. It moves ahead of agreement and changes what reality can even include. You've already felt it. In the moment you saw someone do what everyone said was impossible, in the conversation that shattered, your sense of limitation, in the dream that lingered, as if it came from a truer place than your waking life. Those were moments when you stopped agreeing, not loudly, not rebelliously, but silently, deeply, subtly enough that your frequency shifted and the illusion cracked. Because this reality doesn't need your obedience. It needs your participation. It needs you to keep playing along, to keep choosing the safe belief, the collective rhythm, the comfortable untruth. But you've started choosing otherwise. You've started to withdraw agreement from narratives that make you shrink, from identities that feel like cages, from systems that tell you your worth can be measured. And with every withdrawal, your world softens. It becomes more fluid, more malleable, more yours. Because truth was never rigid. It was always relational, a dance between memory and potential. And when enough people stop agreeing to the version of reality that harms them, forgets them, traps them, the old world collapses, not in fire, but in frequency. So ask yourself, what are you still agreeing to? Just to belong? What version of reality are you holding in place? Out of fear, habit, or politeness? And what might become possible? If you simply said, no more, you wake up, and before your soul can stretch, you reach for a screen. It's instinct now, a reflex, as if touching glass, will ground you more than touching the earth. And just like that, you're gone. Pulled into timelines that aren't yours, thoughts that aren't yours, desires that were planted by a machine that studies you better than you study yourself. This is the great distraction. Not chaos, not calamity, not war in the old-fashioned sense, but attention, stolen, splintered, scattered, until you can't tell the difference between intuition and impulse. You weren't distracted because you're weak. You were distracted because you're powerful. Because if even for one breath you remembered who you are, the illusion would start to rot. So they keep you scrolling, swiping, reacting, endlessly consuming, so you forget how to create. They fill your feed with noise, so you forget your signal. They flood your nervous system with urgency, so you never settle deep enough to hear the ancient instructions stored in your blood, and slowly the sacred becomes secondary. The internal, irrelevant, the mystical, impractical. But underneath the notifications, beneath the performance, behind the consumption, something still calls, a great remembering. It lives in the lump in your throat. When you hear a song that feels like home, it stirs when you see a stranger. And know their soul. It burns in the question that won't leave you alone. What am I doing here? You were never meant to forget, only to return. Not to the past, but to the origin, the root, the place before programming, where you walked in rhythm with the unseen and trusted your own fire. You were not born to be efficient. You were born to be embodied, and your embodiment is the greatest threat to a system built on distraction, because a present soul cannot be manipulated. A grounded being cannot be sold a false self. A remembering heart doesn't need permission. So when the world pulls louder, pause, put your hand on your chest, Breathe past the noise. Listen for what was never lost, only buried, and choose, again and again, to return to that place where the sacred hums louder than the screen. Because every time you remember, you make it easier for the next soul to wake from the spell. They never asked your soul to speak. They asked it to obey, to fall in line, to stay polite, to follow the rules, even when those rules were written by those who've never met your truth. You were not born obedient. You were born attuned to sensation, to intuition, to the wild rhythm of existence. That doesn't answer to clocks or kings, but obedience was rewarded. Early, often, systematically. You learned that compliance was survival. That saying yes, even when everything in you screamed no, would earn you protection, affection, approval. And so the obedience deepened. You obeyed the curriculum, even when your questions had no room. You obeyed the religion, even when it contradicted your experience. You obeyed the culture, even when it demanded you slice off parts of yourself, just to fit in. And eventually you forgot the difference between obedience and betrayal. But your soul didn't. Your soul remembers that obedience is not virtue, when what you're obeying is a distortion. It remembers that truth doesn't bow. It burns. That purpose doesn't whisper. It roars. That destiny doesn't ask for permission. It claims you. You've felt it. In the tension in your chest, when you say yes too quickly, in the anger that rises, when your silence is mistaken for consent, in the quiet grief that visits when you abandon yourself to stay good. Because the soul is not good. It is true, and truth doesn't fit neatly into systems made to sanitize spirit. So stop apologizing for your resistance, for your fire, for your refusal to make yourself smaller so others can stay comfortable. Your soul is not here to obey. It is here to disrupt, to bring codes from before time, to remember paths that were buried, to speak languages that haven't been heard in centuries. You were never meant to follow. You were meant to remember. And every time you say no, when your body says no, every time you question what others take for granted, every time you trust the fire in your belly more than the fear in their eyes, you are obeying the only law that ever mattered, the law of your own becoming. You didn't just forget. You were made to forget. Strategically, deliberately, repeatedly, from the moment your spirit descended into this density, into this name, into this skin. The veils began closing. The forgetting was not random. It was ritual, an ancient architecture designed to dim your knowing until you mistook survival for purpose. They called it growing up, called it socialization, education, reality. But every system here was built like a labyrinth. Its goal not to teach you, but to keep you walking in circles. So long that you forget the sky was ever yours. You forgot the sound of your own soul. You forgot that magic was once muscle. That prayer didn't require words, that your imagination wasn't escapism. It was memory bleeding through the veil. This world is layered, with distractions disguised as dreams, with comforts designed to tame, with stories so carefully spun. You believed them, even as they hollowed you out. And when you began to question, they handed you diagnoses, pills, algorithms, new mirrors to get lost in. Because nothing threatens this place more than someone who remembers the codes in the trees, the wisdom in the wound, the song before language, remembers that the pain isn't pathology, it's prophecy, that your grief is not a weakness, it's a door, that your fire is not dysfunction, it's a map home. This place was built to make you forget. But forgetting is not failure. It is the test, and you are passing. every time you choose stillness over stimulus, every time you follow the pull that makes no logical sense but feels like scripture in your spine, every time you remember, even for a moment, that you are not just human, but portal, not just body, but bridge. You are here to remember for more than yourself. You are the memory of your ancestors, made flesh. The whisper of your future, made present. This place will keep trying to make you forget. Let it try. But you remember now, and that is more dangerous than they ever prepared for. You want to leave, to escape, to break the illusion so completely that you never feel its grip again. It's tempting to sever, to retreat, to vanish into higher realms, where density can't reach you. But here's the paradox. You don't wake up by leaving the dream. You wake up by seeing it fully and staying present within it. The illusion doesn't dissolve because you exit it. It dissolves because you stop believing it. Because awakening isn't an exit. It's an integration, a return to yourself, while still walking through a world designed to distract you from yourself. You don't have to become a ghost to be free. You don't have to shed your humanness. You came here to be in it, to taste the forgetting. So your remembering would be undeniable. To look at the chaos and say, "This is illusion, Dash, and I will love anyway." To walk through distortion and still choose clarity. To sit in noise and still hear the whisper. To be inside the simulation and still be the signal. Waking up doesn't mean abandoning the world. It means redefining your relationship to it. You stop reacting. You start responding. You stop obeying. You start remembering. The world keeps spinning. But you move from a different center now. One that isn't threatened by madness. One that doesn't mistake the mirror for the face. You learn to laugh, to dance with the distortion, to weep without drowning, to feel without collapsing. You stop needing everyone to see what you see, because awakening is not a group project. It's a sacred solitude, woven with deep connection. To those who remember alongside you, you realize you don't have to convince the dream to change. You only have to become lucid within it. That is the revolution, not to run, but to stay, and still not forget, to love without illusion, to give without needing to be seen, to create as a mirror of the real, in a world addicted to copies. You came here to remember, and now that you have, you are not leaving. You are anchoring, bringing the real into the unreal, the eternal into the temporal, the sacred into the synthetic. You are the glitch in the matrix, the dreamer who woke up and chose to walk back in. Not to sleep again, but to light the way. And when others stir, start to question, start to remember. They'll find you there, not above, not beyond, but right here, awake, alive, and unshaken.